Here, read this.
Woof.
Hello everybody, Ash here from the Ear Read This podcast. Now, not so long ago, I made one of the long-form podcast episodes about The Tempest, one of my favourite plays. If you're a fan, check that out. I had a great guest, Paul Edmondson. And around that time, I also read a bunch of novels based on The Tempest, just to try and sort of supplement my my podcast reading. So I thought I'd make a quick video going through those, comparing them, and giving you some recommendations, or in some cases, some anti-recommendations. And first up is a novel called Calibans Hour. This is written by the prolific fantasy author Tad Williams. Came out in 1993. It's set 20 years after the events of The Tempest, and as the title implies, it is a Caliban book. So Caliban has stolen passage from his island to Naples to wreak revenge on Miranda. Prospero is dead by now. Miranda is 20 years older. She has a daughter who is the subject of a completely ridiculous conclusion. So anyway, Caliban in the opening pages of the novel steals into Miranda's chambers, tells her his life story, basically tells her the story of the Tempest, but from his perspective, also saying that at the end of his story, he's going to suffocate her. That forms basically the frame narrative. The bulk of the novel is the story of Caliban, before, during, and after the events of the Tempest. And there's some interesting stuff in it. We get to see a bit of Sycorax. We get to see how the island was before Prospero. It makes some interesting contradictions to what happens in the play. So there are changes to do with Sycorax's faith, the god's Setebos. Contrary to what Ariel says about not a hair perished in the Tempest, we see that Prospero's magic actually did kill a kind of random sailor. I also like how we get to see Prospero's magic develop. When he first arrives, Caliban has him down as a kind of hedge wizard, he calls him. And in a scene that I think is really one of the best kind of running threads is that Prospero brings little puppets to life and kind of makes them dance. The crux of it, I suppose, is Caliban and Miranda's relationship, which is hinted at in the play, but we don't know quite what happened other than Caliban made some kind of unforgivable advance on her, and hence why he is an abhorred slave by the time the Tempest starts. Here we see Caliban steal upon Miranda bathing, a bit like Diana, and they have a kind of brief, sunny, Edenic bliss where the two of them spend time together as Prospero is wrapped up in his books until Ariel destroys this Eden, turns Caliban in, and that's when the relationships sour. I felt once that did happen, we do get the characterization becomes a little bit black and white. It's difficult to imagine some of the developments that are even within the play happening with a Caliban that is so reasonable and a Prospero that is so unbendingly harsh. And whilst it's impossible not to feel for Caliban, especially if you think of the Caliban in the play, but I did think some of it got a little bit over the top. I mean, holding a grudge for 20 years before coming to exact revenge on Miranda. Once we've heard inside Caliban's head, which of course we don't in The Tempest, and we've heard how sensitive and reasonable he was, or he at least was before the fallout with Prospero, it becomes difficult to believe he would also be so begrudging. Towards the end, he tells Miranda, I think it's towards the time Miranda is leaving the island, "You were dressed in your finest clothes. I wore only rags and mud, and my head garlanded with briar tangles." Yeah, at the moment where he was sort of transformed into Jesus, I thought that it was getting a little bit much. So the best stuff, I think, is kind of pre-play. Anyway, not necessarily the stuff with Sycorax is really good. They have an interesting relationship. It's not a kind of loving relationship, particularly. It's quite antagonistic as well. And then the sort of early days with Prospero, when they're kind of trying to work each other out, the magical element of the storyline is sort of developing. I thought was the best bit. The actual action of the Tempest is over pretty quickly. And yeah, it's a slight book. If you are in the mood for Tempest material, I recommend it. I think what I came away from it feeling was that it reads like a very conscientious actor who was playing Caliban, mapping out what has happened to him in great detail. Okay, so next up, we've had a Caliban sequel. Time for a Miranda one. This is Miranda in Milan by Katherine Duckett. This is from 2019. I really like the premise of this one. It's sort of, as the title implies, has Miranda returning to Milan sort of directly after the events of the Tempest this time. And as Duckett writes, when Miranda came to Milan, she found she was a monster. So the twist that you're expecting is that she is basically like a Caliban in her own land. She has been raised for the vast majority of her life on the Enchanted Island. She returns to where she was born, Milan, but she is now closer to Caliban than any of her fellow citizens. But that's not really how the novel pans out. She also finds out that she's a lesbian, which is, I mean, she hasn't laid eyes on any men before, and she hasn't laid eyes on any women either, so I guess that sort of tracks. Ferdinand is just kind of forgotten about, and Miranda shacks up with a serving girl for some really, really awful sex. Miranda drank Dorothea in, reveling in the smell of sweat on her skin, the tug of her teeth on Miranda's lower lip. Dorothea was sand and sea, Miranda thought dizzily. She was wind and water and heat all at once, a tempest of her own making. We have that developing alongside this sort of gothic subplot, which could have been really interesting and also taps into a seam of criticism that I talked about on the podcast. If you've listened to it, you might remember me talking about Scott Maisano, who was, in a very adventurous and playful essay, was suggesting that The Tempest is the first Frankenstein story. He pulls together the fact that Prospero says at one point that I know how to resurrect the dead, and the fact that Miranda can't remember much in that backward abysm of time. He puts those two things together and suggests that Miranda actually died in the passage to the island. She drowned, but then Prospero used his art and revived her, and that's why they've never really talked about what happened. So a potential tension in the play is Prospero wondering what everyone is going to make of this zombie daughter of his, and also how she is going to react. Well, Katherine Duckett has either picked up on something similar or read that and spun it into fiction, because Prospero has raised relatives from the dead, but in this case it's not Miranda, it's his wife. She is actually alive in a kind of disfigured, zombified state, scuttling around the dungeons in Milan, and Miranda is brought into contact with her, and they are reunited. Meanwhile, Prospero is a completely and comically unambiguous evil villain. There is no shades of grey whatsoever with him. We discover that he was abusive. He beat Miranda when she tried to train her own Ariel on the island. So we discover that there's multiple spirits, that Ariel wasn't the only one. He he shakes his fist at Miranda and Dorothea and says, "With sapphic temptations, you've led her astray." There are bits that are sort of difficult not to laugh at, how just over the top Prospero is. Miranda remembers at one point her father pulling Sycorax's bones from the shallow grave in which they lay and making them dance in front of Caliban as he wept in the firelight. However harsh your reading of Prospero is, it's pretty difficult to reconcile some of the things he does in this novel with how he is in the play. He might be abusive, he might be controlling, he's not a psychopath. And also, crucially, the ending of the play hinges on him retiring his art. That's the climax, or it's the resolution, rather. But no, in this one, we just get told that he has been building up his powers on the island in order to return to Milan full strength and destroy it. So the ending of The Tempest is completely undone. He also murdered his nephew, so Antonio's son, Prospero murdered. And the reason he has to have done this is because Miranda needs to side with Antonio, the villain of the play The Tempest. So we have to make him, less villainous than Prospero. There was a line about, well, Miranda liked Antonio not, but he had ruled in peace. He had managed the state well and kept his people from sickness and starvation. He was nothing like her father. which I thought at the time it sounds a bit like how people defend Boris. Well, he's a treacherous, lying scumbag, but he's getting the big calls right. And spoiler alert, because I will have to talk about the ending of this one because it's mad. Prospero ends up getting knifed to death in a dungeon. We leave him sort of screaming in agony, which is nice. And then we have this ludicrous moment where the Miranda, Dorothea, and Frankenmother decide to set up a matriarchy of 3 back on the island. So they're going back to Caliban's island. And the way there's the one bit that made me laugh out loud is the way they kind of smooth over the issue of colonialism. In this one, it's just sort of cancelled out by the new LGBT theme. It's just like, well, lesbians sort of cancels out colonialism, so it'll be fine. And we'll learn his language. So that's fine. But yeah, the 3 of them go off, and we're supposed to think that's a happy ending when, however dearly you love your mum and your partner, I can't think of anything worse than living just with your mother and your partner. And it's unfair on all 3 of them. No right, sane person would want to live with only their partner and their mother. No sane mother would want to live with their offspring and their offspring's partner. And poor old Dorothea having to live with her partner and her Franken mother-in-law for the rest of her life. Yeah, it's a kind of ludicrous book, really. If it was a little less sort of worthy and a little bit more embracing of the schlockiness, or if it just focused on one of the strands, like I really did like the idea of Miranda being, a stranger in a strange land in her own place of birth. And I really do love the resurrection stuff. I was thrilled when that's kind of developed, but it's difficult to take if it's not sort of camp. It made me think of, Gothic stories by people like Stevenson, where there's a sort of oversaturated campness to it, which makes it so enjoyable, whereas here it was all done very, very straight-faced. So yeah, not great, that one. Moving on, we have a Midsummer Tempest by Poul Anderson, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, from 1974. He wrote a series of multiverse novels, and some of those characters from that series appear in this. This is the first one I've read of his, so I felt when certain characters popped up that I was clearly supposed to recognise them, but I didn't. But that didn't detract from the book, really. It was only a sort of short section where that happened. This one has a fantastic premise. Basically, we're in the Civil War, and the whole premise of the novel is that Shakespeare is history. Not that he is dead and gone, but that he is the great historian. His plays are history. Everything that happened in his plays actually happened in the history of this universe, which has all kinds of interesting effects on the world. Fairies exist, thanks to plays like Midsummer Night's Dream. Technology is advanced thanks to various historical slip-ups by Shakespeare. The English are everywhere, of course, because they speak English in Rome, in Denmark, in Greece. And the characters in the plays are, well, some of them are still around and some of them sort of live on in memory. Our main character is the dashing Rupert of the Rhine, a real historically real royalist who fought in the Civil War, and he ends up in this kind of caper plot to retrieve Prospero's magical articles from the Enchanted Island. That's sort of like the MacGuffin of the plot. I really enjoyed this, but I did find that the best part was looking around in the world. I kind of wanted to wander around in the novel and ignore the plot, which was fairly, run around chasing MacGuffins. The sort of offhand moments where Anderson had to come up with Anderson and his characters came up with explanations for plot holes in Shakespeare, how technology has advanced and the kind of resistance to it, and the sort of Shakespearean cameos. I did enjoy the novel. I almost wish it was a 500-pager where we got plenty of typically fantasy-type world building and had a chapter on how each play had kind of figured in the history. But wonderful enough idea to recommend. Moving on, now we have probably the most famous book on this list, Hag-Seed by Margaret Atwood. This is part of the Hogarth series of novels based on Shakespeare's works. In it, an embittered theatre director takes revenge on the colleagues who lost him his job. After years of exile, he then gets a job in a prison and stages a production of The Tempest inviting his enemies to the performance in order to exact his revenge. It's not only a story about staging a production of The Tempest, the novel is in fact a retelling of The Tempest as well, with Atwood naming all of her characters after Shakespeare's. So Antonio is called Tony. Prospero, the character based on Prospero, calls himself Mr. Duke, and his real name is Felix. Felix meaning happy or good fortuned. Prosperous, you might say. The character based on Gonzalo is called Sal. We have a Lonnie and a Frederick. I'll let you work those out yourself. A character who functions as Ariel is called Estelle, who Atwood actually tells us has stellar points. Estelle has stellar points. Estelle says at one point, "Think of me as lubricant." I thought this novel was awful. I've tried with Atwood a few times. I've always wondered what I've been missing. The people whose opinion I rate her, and I've never really got why. Never really got why. This is by far and away the worst novel by her I've read. It's awful. It's feels like it comes from a school of novels and films, a trend that I hope is dead, which was putting really dark spins on fairy tales. And The Tempest is kind of a fairy tale, but there seemed a real vogue for that a while ago, where it'd be like, a serial killer novel called The Gingerbread Man. And it would be, well, the thing with mine is, instead of the fairy tale, he's a guy who kills kids with bread, but only the ginger ones. It's sort of like a really dark twist. That's the attitude you feel throughout this novel, and it's really unlikable and so stupid. Like, no one ever wonders why all the people involved in a production of The Tempest are effectively characters in The Tempest. The sort of strange music and visions in the Tempest play are replaced with date rape drugs. Magic itself is just replaced with the internet. Why have Ariel when you could have this new gremlin? Google. The internet is written about with all of the freshness of someone in their 70s who was introduced to the interwebs yesterday by a millennial relative. I've got a quote here. "It was amazing how much you could learn about a person over the net. There was Felix reading his Google alerts, and there were Tony and Sal bustling about in the world, not suspecting that they had a shadower, a watcher, a waiter, an internet stalker." So we have really interesting scenes where people meet in a McDonald's and ask to be someone's friend on Facebook. Someone watches a horror movie on Rotten Tomatoes. That was good. The writing style itself is awful. Felix, the main character based on Prospero, has lost his daughter Miranda. We return to the theme of dead Mirandas, weirdly. And at one point he says, Atwood writes, "Now she's little more than an outline he fills with sadness." It is genuinely quite embarrassing at parts. There are some digs at what Atwood supposes are theatrical mores, so silly ideas that theatre people have, which is fine. I'm all for digs at ridiculous ideas of theatre people, but the ones she comes up with are kind of better than the ideas that she uses for her own novel. And then the portrayal of the prisoners, so it all revolves around this production at the Fletcher Correctional Players, featuring all of these prisoners who are initially resistant to Shakespeare, but then once they're told that Shakespeare is full of violence and revenge, they get really into it and say things like, and I quote, "Hey, Brutus, brutal. Monster, cool. Wicked. Hey, like something wicked this way comes. That's wicked too." The names of the prisoners, I'm not joking, are things like 8 Hands with a Z, Hot Wire, Legs, double G, Phil the Pill, Timmy's, Snake Eye, and a crooked accountant whose street name is Bent Pencil. I think Atwood did some research by actually hanging out with Top Cat for a few months. Felix, the Prospero character, is basically like Michelle Pfeiffer in Dangerous Minds, sort of sitting on the back of the chair and going, "I know nobody gets you, but I do, and Shakespeare does." At one point, this was brilliant, he says, "I don't care why you're in here or what they say you've done. For this course, the past is prologue. which means we begin counting time and accomplishments right here, right now, which is, of course, precisely not what the past is prologue means at all. What Atwood is describing there is wiping the slate clean. If you were to say what's past is prologue to an arsonist, you would follow it up by saying, and that's why we've brought all of these fire extinguishers in. Oh, there's a rap. I forgot there's a rap. I'm the man, I'm the Duke of Milan. You want to get pay, gotta do what I say. Wasn't always this way, no. I was once this dude called Antonio. I won't force you to listen to any more, but that's how long one of the raps is. And does Felix respond? Felix, the kind of embittered theatre director who has highfalutin tastes, does he react with saying, that's crap, lads, that's awful, just read the script? No, of course he doesn't. He goes, these kids got talent. No one's ever done Shakespeare as rap before. This is like really edgy and progressive. Felix had to admit it was pretty amazing, which is like how he also thinks the idea of Ariel being basically Storm in the X-Men is also a really good idea that no one's ever thought of. Yeah, it's an awful, awful book, like shockingly bad. Nothing to recommend it, to be honest. Badly written, a crap idea, horrible. But moving on with relief, we come to this book, Indigo, by Marina Warner. This is from 1992, also called Mapping the Waters. This is a epic multi-generational novel that tells the story of the Everard family and the islands of Enfant Beat, my pronunciation might be bad there, based loosely on St. Kitts and Nevis. It's set over hundreds of years from 17th century Caribbean to London in the 60s. If I was going to sum it up for you, it is the ultimate post-colonial adaptation of The Tempest. I think in my episode on The Tempest, you might have picked up on a note of like exasperation at post-colonial adaptations of The Tempest. My guest Paul said at one point, it's certainly a magical play before it's a colonial one. And, he also says there have been many great post-colonial adaptations of The Tempest, but I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I kind of share what I think he's feeling. And I do think that what has been a very successful interpretation has sort of blended into what people think The Tempest was about, and always has been about. You hear people, in fact, when I made that video about the Tempest film with Helen Mirren, you had people in the production, I think maybe it was even the director, saying, yeah, Shakespeare's writing about colonialism here, for sure, and slavery. I think that's, at best, very, very speculative. And I disagree that that's what the play is about. I think that's what, as I say, very successful adaptations have been about. The interpretation works brilliantly. All of the ingredients are there for a wonderful post-colonial adaptation of The Tempest, which there have been many times. But I think they've been so successful that people automatically include them even when they don't really have much to say themselves about colonialism. So what you end up with are kind of like the aesthetics of colonialism without any commentary. Caliban might be seen in chains, or the actor playing Gonzalo will really raise his eyebrows when he has to say the word plantation, give the audience a significant look, even though plantations wouldn't have carried the sort of immediate connotation of slave labor camps for Shakespeare as they do to us. So the first reason I love this book so much is it does post-colonial adaptations of The Tempest justice. And the first way it does that is the multi-generational elements of the book. You have the time and the space in a novel like this to witness properly how grievances resonate, transform, and scar over centuries and centuries. It's completely successful in portraying that. It reminded me quite a lot of Iris Murdoch in its wide cast of characters and nonchalantly casual relationship with magic. I love how magic is handled in this book. It's there, it's sometimes explicitly and sometimes not. It really feels in the same way as The Tempest as a kind of fairy tale. And unlike some of the black and white representations of Prospero and Miranda we've seen in earlier novels, Indigo is full of characters who, some of them do unforgivable things that are not punished. Some of them do forgivable things that are. Some characters make mistakes and are forgiven, and yet the damage that they have caused continues to kind of rumble on and cause problems for people down the line. Like some of the other novels, we have a Sycorax, we have a Caliban, we have an Ariel, we have a character called Miranda. But what I like about this book is that there's quite a few there's a few occasions where there are multiple candidates for one Tempest character. There are a few Prosperos. There are a few Ariels. It's not just a sort of like the last book where it's just plonkety plonk, easy analogy, goofy name type thing. And when the Tempest is evoked, it feels incredibly satisfying, shivery, and justified. It's never doesn't have that kind of tacky Easter egg sort of feeling. Just as an example, this is when we're in London, I think. Yeah, we're in London in the 40s. They had reached the traffic island before the last crossing. She would pick out the stripes by bending down to peer at her feet. Her father held her tightly and thought, planes passing through cloud bump about. Obscurity isn't entirely insubstantial like a ghost. You can't set foot on a path of cirrus, or climb a fleecy pile of cumulus as if it were a haystack. No. But fog exerts pressure. It chokes you and blinds you and baffles you. Then when you put your hand out to it, nothing's there, only the wet and the cold. He squeezed his daughter's hand in his, fighting the melancholy that threatened to swallow him with the fog. The thought then came to him that this was a kind of London storm, a choking, poisoned equivalent of a high wind rushing and flattening trees and dwellings in the islands where he was born, a tempest whipping up the sea into a frenzy of destruction and casting fish ashore to die in the branches of trees. In a book that's all about sort of kind of playing God with where people belong, transplanting them over here and assuming it would work in that kind of colonial fervour, moments like that are so wonderful, and you can evoke, just as there are people who are either from the islands or were brought up in the islands in London or vice versa, both locations are evoked in the most kind of banal of circumstances, which is another part of the novel's magic. I was shocked when I was looking this up to discover that Marina Warner's own family had a similar kind of background. Her ancestor actually established a colony in the 17th century in the Caribbean. And she says at one point in this interview that I found that writing the book, she wasn't trying to... she thought it was important that the people that had kind of profited from that wrote about it. And she said the book was not a way of suing for forgiveness, which I thought perfectly encapsulates the book and its big change from The Tempest. The Tempest is about forgiveness. The Tempest ends on a note of promise of forgiveness. The inter-family disputes and betrayals are forgivable in the action of The Tempest. But how do you forgive something like historical colonialism? It's impossible to forgive, even when you're dealing with descendants of the colonizers. They had nothing to do with it themselves, but they have biologically profited from it. Those sorts of wrongs are unforgivable in moral terms and in practical terms. And Marina Warner presents that really effectively, movingly, and kind of extensively, trying to take in as many different points of view as possible. So there you have it. There are 5 novels about the Tempest. Only one of them really a completely wholehearted recommendation. There's a couple of slighter ones at the start that are fun. Avoid Hag-Seed, which was the shock. Definitely read Indigo and Marina Warner elsewhere. She's written often about fairy tales. She wrote a fantastic introduction to Leonora Carrington's, I think it was Down Below she wrote the introduction to, but yeah, she's great. So yeah, there you have it. That's 5 novels based on The Tempest. I might try and do this again with another play, or I might sort of cast my net a bit further back and try and find some older novels based on The Tempest. That's all for now, though. Until next time, happy reading.